Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. This is the fourth entry in a series of videos in which I review and discuss each and every Warlord and signature squad we've seen released thus far, and today I'm going to focus on both the best and worst aspects on the very first of our Chaos faction warlords, Zarathur High Sorcerer. Keep in mind that although at this point we've seen the release of each and every expansion of the Warlord cycle of war packs, in this video I'm only going to be assessing the card synergy present within the core set, although in later videos I'll be covering not only the other core warlords, but the non-signature faction cards of the core set and our various war packs as well. But cutting right to the chase, let's see what our first Chaos Warlord has to offer. He is the unique unit Zarathur, with the Psyker and Tzeentch traits, an attack value of 1, a relatively low 6 hit points, a starting hand size of 7, 7 starting resource tokens, and the text Interrupt. When damage is assigned to an enemy unit at this planet, increase that damage by 1. And as we're going to be seeing throughout this entire video, this warlord in particular really appeals to the way that I like to play games. We've already covered the Astra Militarum warlord Colonel Strachan, who has the ability of bolstering soldier and warrior trait units' attack values by a single point, but Zarathur's ability is so much more potent than that. So long as you're dealing damage at his location, whether it's him, one of your other army or token units, if it's from an event, attachment, or even a support, no matter where that damage comes from, during that very first step of damage resolution, when you're initially assigning that damage, you increase it by 1. So even if your opponent intends to shield some of that damage, they're always going to have to cope with much more damage than they otherwise would. Even though you can readily see that his attack value is a paltry 1, remember that this ability of his does indeed affect his own attacks. So even though he doesn't have the same 2 attack value as many of the other core warlords do, he's nevertheless going to be striking enemy units for 2 points of damage. Without a doubt, the greatest drawback of this warlord is that he has to potentially endanger himself in order for you to benefit from his ability. And if you're so unlucky as to have him bloodied, as you can see, he loses so much of his appeal. He maintains that very low 1 attack value, and his hit points are a measly 5. But more than anything else, you miss out on that absolutely spectacular ability, which not only enhances so many Chaos faction cards, but synergizes to an incredible extent, taking a look at his signature squad. And in addition to bolstering your own effects, depending on the warlord and faction that your opponent is playing, you can punish them all the more for daring to play cards that happen to include incurring damage as either part of their cost or their resolution. For instance, the Orc faction, if they're running their warlord Nozdreg, his flash gets, in order to ready themselves, ultimately inflict a single point of damage to themselves, and if they do that at Zarathur's location, that 1 damage becomes 2. Whether you're using it or your opponent is using it, Orc Cannon works in your favor, in that, again, Zarathur is enhancing that damage, and as I mentioned before, keep in mind that this is only amplifying the damage that the enemy is incurring. His ability at no point penalizes you, and taken all together, this warlord has the capability of inflicting enormous amounts of damage at his location. I mentioned previously that he has to expose himself in order for you to get the most benefit out of his ability, just because where combat is at its thickest, where everything is the most dangerous, that's where you probably want him, so he's in the thick of things, and you can get as much damage amplification as possible. Even though he might run a little bit of a risk of being bloodied, if that's the case, you can nevertheless use any number of different cards that I'll be discussing shortly in order to dish out tremendous amounts of damage in the action windows preceding any kind of battle and long before Zarathur might end up taking any modicum of damage. To get the absolute most out of this Warlord, it's great to deal as much damage from as many different sources of damage as you possibly can. And for this reason, he benefits tremendously from your deploying extremely cheap army units and getting as many token units onto the battlefield as you possibly can. So when you're running this Warlord, I would always opt to fill the field with units to the best of your ability, as opposed to playing one or two hardy, heavy-hitting, resilient combatants. And along that same vein, any army unit that can deploy area effect is sure to become your best friend, as if you're able to ping multiple units at once, each and every occurrence of damage is going to be amplified by his ability. So even the Dark Eldar army unit Kabbalite Strike Force, with its one area effect point of damage, that can nevertheless hit innumerable enemy army, token, and even warlord units for a single point of damage doubled to 2. And similarly, if you're able to deploy the 5-cost Vicious Bloodletter, and you can leverage that area effect 3 in your favor, being able to deal an incredible, immense 4 points of damage to every enemy unit on the opposite side of the battlefield is absolutely incredible, and Zarathur's ability, combined with a host of different card effects, can easily turn a decisive battle in your favor if you manage to play this ability smartly. Given the sheer potency of this Warlord's ability, you have myriad ways of really dishing out tremendous damage to your opponent. Whether it's swarming low-cost, inexpensive units like Goth Boys and Shoot-'em-mobs, so that for a tiny resource investment you can deal out enormous amounts of amplified damage, or whether you're using cards like Promise of Glory or Snotling Attack to fill your side of the board with token units that, even though they hit for 1, that quickly becomes an intolerable amount of damage for your opponent to stomach. And if it just so happens that you're going up against bigger targets, you're also welcome to deploy army units like Burna Boys that can not only hit for an impressive 5, boosted up to 6, but has the added benefit of splashing some additional damage that is, in turn, also amplified onto a weaker, more fragile, or situationally vulnerable unit. The number of unit kills you can score deploying this Warlord is absolutely incredible, and although in some ways Zarathur strikes me as somewhat of a high-risk, high-reward type Warlord, he just seems leaps and bounds more safe and consistent to me than does a similar Warlord like Nozdreg, where there's still the potential for enormous amounts of damage, but with Zarathur, it's really you that gets to decide when you can turn that damage up a notch, and there are so many fewer ways that your opponent can throw a wrench in your most careful of designs. Even if your opponent is lucky enough to get a very large, very intimidating and powerful unit at the same planet as Zarathur, and actually poses a threat to potentially bloodying him, since Chaos can ally with Dark Eldar, you're very much free to use Archon's Terror in your advantage, for a measly investment of 2 resources, routing any non-unique unit and sending them packing back to your opposing player's headquarters, so that big Death Star unit no longer poses any threat to Zarathur. The list of cards that synergizes with Zarathur goes on and on and on, because absolutely anything that deals damage gets even better if it happens to resolve at his location. Particularly if you're able to surprise your opponent, whether you're attaching Dire Mutation as a surprise source of damage to units during the combat round, or you're using Orc Cannon. It's quite possible that your opponent has to stomach and distribute way more damage than they might be able to handle or were in any case expecting. Warp Storm can prove to be a tremendous source of damage, particularly considering that one of the signature squad cards we're going to be discussing for Zarathur is an attachment that's rather welcome when affixed to your own units. And even though Warp Storm can kill indiscriminately, remember again that Zarathur's ability at no point triggers to amplify the amount of damage incurred by your own units. And, similar to Warp Storm, but with the added benefit of being an army unit, dealing a little bit less damage to your own forces, and putting a command icon onto the field under your control, Weird Boy Maniac can also be a fantastic source of 2B amplified damage if you're really looking to leverage a planet against your opponent. And last but not least, I'll mention that Tzeentch's Firestorm, an extraordinarily potent, albeit potentially exceptionally expensive event, gets all the better in that so long as you're targeting a unit at Zarathur's location, you're able to essentially save one resource, or, if resources are a limiting factor for you, kill a unit that you potentially might not have otherwise been able to if you were coming up short on resource tokens. All in all, I really cannot find enough good things to say about Zarathur. I'm sure I already sound like a broken record throughout this video talking about the constant damage amplification that he can inflict, but really, this is an incredible ability. I feel like it's going to be triggering frequently, and at a moment's notice, it might be able to turn what seems like an inevitable chaos loss into a sudden headache for your opponent. But now that I've hopefully more than adequately sung Zarathur's praises onto his signature squad, the first of which is the 2-cost army unit Zarathur's Flamers, with one command icon, the Daemon and Tzeentch traits, 2 attack value, 2 hit points, and the text, Action. Sacrifice this unit to deal 2 damage to a target non-Warlord unit at the same planet. And if I liked Zarathur, in conjunction with our Warlord, I absolutely love this army unit. Not only is it very cheap with reasonable stats and a command icon to win command struggles for you, so that you're generating additional resources, drawing additional cards to fuel Zarathur's ability all the better, with the Warlord present, this enemy strikes for a modified 3 attack. The base of 2 amplified by 1 when you go to actually assign that damage. Plus, that ability is absolutely fantastic in that it's not restricted to any one phase, and it can be used after this unit attacks and or while it's exhausted. Keep in mind that at the very beginning of the combat phase, prior to any battling whatsoever, there's an action window, and if you don't have the initiative token, if you don't have ranged units working for you, you're quite welcome to sacrifice this unit to do 2 or 3 points of damage to a non-Warlord unit at the same planet. So even if you'd maybe have lost this unit to a ranged attack, it nevertheless facilitates a trade, which again can help turn the tide of battle over the course of the game very much in your favor. I absolutely love the glass cannon playstyle, and I feel like Chaos and Zarathur in particular very much appeal to that predisposition of mine. Also worth considering is that if your opponent is getting sick of running up against a lot of small sources of damage that absolutely wreck a horde of enemy units, for instance, if they're used to deploying a lot of tokens against you and you're using area effect abilities and things of that nature to destroy their forces en masse, maybe if they're deploying flying units against you so that any kind of combat damage they incur ends up being halved, remember that any direct source of damage does its full assignment against flying units, so long as your Warlord is present. Even against an opposing Black Legion Helldrake, that can be an enormous 3 points of damage that practically clears half of that 8 resource cost unit's pool of hit points. Even though the damage from that action and from its attack can be shielded, your opponent might find themselves running out of shield cards very quickly, and if you're forcing them to use a lot of their valuable cards just to shield, then each and every time they block a point or 3 of damage, they have 1 less card to leverage against you, again making it all the more likely that over the course of the game, you might pull together an inevitable and impossible to stop victory. If you are using events like the Orc Cannon or maybe deploying the Weird Boy Maniac, keep in mind that when it comes to Zarathur's Flamers, because you're probably going to be sacrificing them, you can damage them so long as you don't kill them relatively indiscriminately. And over the course of discussing Zarathur's other signature cards, you'll find that the level of synergy available to this army unit is absolutely incredible, and the fact that you get 4 copies of this card to put in your deck is absolutely fantastic. As with any Chaos unit, you're free to take advantage of cards like the Fortress of Madness support to reduce its cost by 1 upon playing it, or if you're using Splintered Path Acolytes to try and win command struggles, you can deploy this card absolutely for free. Or if you have a plethora of Cultist tokens, those 1/1 Cultist trait tokens can, in maybe more dire straits, or if they're deployed at a planet where they're just not needed, can save you additional resources in sacrificing themselves so that you can play this enormously powerful army unit for even less than it already is, down to the easily attainable cost of 0. And because it counts as a demon, particularly considering that it's almost guaranteed to be leaving play, and almost always when you choose for it to do so, you can choose, if you'd like, to take advantage of Murder Cogitator, where for the cost of revealing the top card of your deck, it's possible that you could add units to your hand, which could potentially be additional copies of Zarathur's Flamers, or could potentially be any number of other nasty Chaos units. And, quite possibly some of the nastier synergy available to use with this army unit, you can leverage ranged effects in your favor. Cards like the Attachment Rocket Launcher, or the Dark Eldar army unit Sybarite Marksman, and put those on other units, just so that you can take full advantage of that range skirmish to pick off units, and then have Zarathur's Flamers possibly attack, or, if your opponent has initiative, possibly just sacrifice itself prior to your enemy attacking, taking full advantage of those action windows so that you can dish out as much damage as chaotically possible prior to your opponent having much, if any, opportunity to resist you. And as with anything else, in conjunction with your Warlord, any combination of these effects can be absolutely overwhelming and appear utterly insurmountable to even the most stalwart of opposing players. Plus, if Zarathur's Flamers, either by itself or in conjunction with any number of different effects, isn't enough to kill off those big, heavy, and resilient enemy units, you can always combo it with potent direct damage effects like Tzeentch's Firestorm to ensure those killing blows. But the madness does not end there, because Zarathur's Flamers has much more synergistic, combo-friendly cards yet to come in the rest of Zarathur's signature squad, such as the zero-cost attachment, Mark of Chaos, with an enormous 3 shield icons, and the trait Curse. It reads, attached to an army unit and interrupt. When attached unit leaves play, deal 1 damage to each enemy unit at this planet. So, much like your Warlord's ability, this only deals damage to enemy units that happen to be at that planet, even though you can opt to affix this attachment to any of your own units. You can either intend to trigger this upon your killing an enemy army unit, or it might be even easier for you to affix this to a copy of Zarathur's Flamers, so that you can decide exactly when that unit is going to be leaving play in order to trigger this potentially potent interrupt. Much like Area Effect 1, this could do a tidal wave of damage to any opposing units, and as with a host of other effects I've already discussed and have yet to mention, at the same planet as your Warlord, this can potentially be incredible. Consider, too, that once we get to another signature squad card, a support that you can deploy on your side of the battlefield, it's possible that you can use a repeatable recursive effect to return this card again and again to your hand to kill a tremendous number of enemy units. And given that this card is free with that tremendous shield value, it's not only versatile, it's not only extraordinarily affordable, that really the only downside I can think of is that you have to play this during the deploy phase, which potentially gives your opponent sufficient time to brainstorm some means of defending against this card. For instance, maybe if you affix this to one of your own units, your opponent might be able to play an Archon's Terror against you, or, at the very least, have a much better idea of where you might be committing your Warlord that turn. Along those same lines, I therefore think it's of the utmost importance that you restrict the mobility of this attachment, in that under no more than the most dire of circumstances do you want to attach this to an enemy army unit like a Wild Rider squadron, or any unit with the mobile keyword, just because if an enemy unit were to shift planets unexpectedly, the odds of you being able to kill that unit not only diminish, but it's all the less likely that you'd get to trigger this attachment under ideal conditions. Particularly considering that this is yet another unfortunate one-copy signature card, I think it's important to probably save this card, if you can't rely on recursive effects, for probably the most decisive battle of the game, where it can potentially make the biggest and most game-defining difference for you. There's a tremendous number of direct damage effects I've already mentioned that you can use to trigger this event, whether it's Zarathur's Flamers, whether it's Tzeentch's Firestorm. Considering just how many effects we already have within the core set alone to trigger this effect exactly when we want it to go off, the fact that this living card game is going to continually add more and more options to a Zarathur player to trigger this under optimal conditions means that it's only going to get stronger and stronger over the lifespan of the game. And in a similar vein, over time we'll see more and more synergistic effects that combo in a fantastic sense with this card. For instance, if you're able to leverage this in your favor and potentially cause a tidal wave of damage to spill over and destroy an enormous number of enemy units, If it just so happens that you have Zave's Split Tongue deployed at that planet, and as we'll shortly see, there are surprise means of dropping him unexpectedly into play, you can generate an enormous number of cultist tokens, which, particularly if they get the opportunity to fight alongside Zarathur, can pile on attack after attack, which, taken all together, can mean an enormous amount of damage distributed amongst any number of enemy units. I certainly think there are indeed going to be many situations where you simply fail to draw a Mark of Chaos, given that it's only a one-copy card, and I'm also sure there's going to be plenty of situations where you aren't quite able to leverage this in your favor, and it doesn't happen to deal nearly as much damage as it has the potential to do, but nevertheless, for that unbeatable cost of 0, it's hard to go wrong with this signature attachment. But keeping this train going on to that support that I alluded to, it is the 1-cost Shrine of Warpflame, a location trait and reading reaction. After an enemy unit is destroyed, exhaust this support to return the topmost Tzeentch card from your discard pile to your hand. So, for an incredibly inexpensive support, a mere cost of 1, once per turn, upon destroying an enemy unit, you have the choice of triggering this reaction to return the topmost Tzeentch card from your discard pile to your hand. I think it is of the utmost importance that players realize that this reaction is optional. So if the ideal card isn't sitting at the top of your discard pile, you can potentially wait until later in that round and then exhaust this support to return that optimal card back to your hand. Or, if you don't have Tzeentch cards coming out of your deck or hand fast and furious, it's possible that even if the card you really want gets buried, over the course of several rounds you can nevertheless dig that card out of your discard pile and put it back into your hand. Although, in all honesty, all of the Tzeentch cards that we've seen thus far are so powerful that I find it very unlikely that players wouldn't be happy with probably any card that they would be able to return to their hand. Really, the biggest pitfall of this is that it's yet another one-copy card that's so tremendously powerful that if you see it early, it could make a huge difference in the outcome of a game. But if you end up seeing it very late, it could nevertheless still prove to make all the difference during that big game-deciding, game-defining, decisive battle. One of the developers of Conquest, Nate French, has clarified that any reaction, whether it be to events or abilities, happens after the resolution of those occurrences. And what that means is that if you play a card like Tzeentch's Firestorm, you resolve that card, it enters your discard pile, and then you have the opportunity to use a reaction like this one. So even if you don't have any cards in your discard pile, you can potentially deal that immense amount of direct damage, and then bring that Tzeentch's Firestorm immediately back to your hand, and you're then welcome to play it again, or wait until some subsequent moment to play it again, after, of course, your opponent has an action window to take their own action. So, as long as you have an adequate amount of resources, you can take advantage of extremely powerful effects time and time again, with the only limiting factors being your resource tokens and the fact that this location can only exhaust once per turn, unless at some point in the future we get a means of readying it. And whether it's an army unit, event, or attachment that's doing the killing, so long as an enemy unit dies, you can still fetch those top cards nevertheless. And unless you don't have any Tzeentch cards whatsoever, which is unlikely considering how full this signature squad alone is with them, This seems like a card that can provide enormous utility, and again, because we'll only ever see additional Tzeentch cards, this is yet another effect that's sure to become all the more powerful over time. And last but certainly not least, we have 2 copies of an event to round out this signature squad. It's the 1-cost Infernal Gateway with 1 shield icon, the power and Tzeentch traits, and it reads combat action. Put a chaos unit with printed cost 3 or lower into play from your hand at a planet. If that unit is still in play at the end of the phase, sacrifice it. So, this is yet another enormously powerful, fantastically useful, and incredible signature card. Not only is it incredibly cheap, but it helps to give you a little bit of a tempo advantage in that this can not only let you put a potentially powerful chaos unit into play for 2 resources less than you'd otherwise pay for it, but it allows you to do so during the combat phase. And seeing as how you have an action window before any battles take place, particularly if you have the initiative, this can allow you to leverage battles and the game state as a whole in your favor. Although whatever unit you happen to choose has to be sacrificed if it remains in play at the end of the phase, keep in mind that I think the perfect use of this event is Zarathur's Flamers. So under ideal conditions, if you happen to deploy that unit at the same planet as your Warlord and you have initiative, you can attack, deal 3 damage to a unit, and then you have an action window where you can sacrifice Zarathur's Flamers to deal 3 damage again. And if you combine that with the support we just discussed, the Shrine of Warpflame, you can return either the Infernal Gateway or Zarathur's Flamers back to your hand, depending on when you choose to trigger that reaction, which in turn depends on when you're destroying enemy units. This allows you an opportunity to dump a tremendously upsetting surprise onto your opponent. And another fantastic means of using this event is to wait until your opponent has taken a combat turn or has completely run out of units to attack with during that combat round, so that whatever unit you choose at the very least gets the opportunity to attack. And again, if you have the initiative token, you might just get the opportunity to attack at least twice with that unit before your opponent can do absolutely anything to resist you. And even though you do have to sacrifice that unit at the end of the phase, considering that battle takes place over a series of rounds, and that the combat phase doesn't end until all battles have concluded, your opponent is basically stuck either killing your unit or otherwise retreating in order to finish that battle. So if they were going to win, maybe they take losses that they weren't counting on incurring. Or maybe you're able to leverage this to such extent that you end up turning a battle in your favor or make an otherwise one-sided battle all the more crushing against your opponent. I think the absolute perfect play for this card is at any planet where you happen to have Zarathur's Flamers and that initiative token. If your Warlord is there, since this is the absolute perfect ideal situation I'm describing, you attack with the Flamers and deal 3 damage to whatever unit you choose. You sacrifice the Flamers and deal another 3 damage. You trigger your Shrine of Warpflame to bounce those Zarathur's Flamers back to your hand, and then you use an action when it's in your favor to do so to play the Infernal Gateway and put that Zarathur's Flamers back into play. You attack again for another 3, and then you sacrifice your Flamers for another 3. And again, if your opponent has run out of units, you can use and abuse those action windows to cram in as many devastating attacks as possible. And with Zarathur present, the amount of damage that the Chaos player can bring to bear against any opponent is absolutely insane. I almost feel sorry for an Orcs player trying to run Nosdrag with his brutal keyword against you just because of the sheer volume of damage that you can dish out at unpredictable intervals against your opponent, where they're so focused on bringing their units into some semi-damaged but still relatively safe threshold. It just seems extraordinarily easy for you to turn the tide of battle and the entire game in your favor by either picking off big, beefy, individual enemy units or culling swarms of tokens and cheap, inexpensive army units through the area effect ability and cards that splatter damage all over the place like Warp Storm and Weird Boy Maniac. Even though this event can only target Chaos units, there are nevertheless a host of reasonable choices to pick from, even if you don't happen to have one of your 4 copies of Zarathur's Flamers in your hand. Namely, the Alpha Legion Infiltrator if you need a single, exceptionally hard-hitting army unit to dump onto the table. Again, taking advantage of action windows allows you to work around your opponent being able to capitalize on that otherwise powerful unit's single hit point. Or maybe you want to be tricky and put an Umbral Preacher into play so that your opponent's army units can't retreat and you get to take full advantage of your Warlord's damage boost, or in any case, any number of potent damaging effects, hopefully during a decisive battle. And if you want to return this to your hand, and the Shrine of Warp Flame isn't enough, or you weren't fortunate enough to draw it, you can use the Dark Eldar ally Colosseum Fighters to return this to your hand, which just might have the added benefit of allowing you to use Shrine of Warp Flame to return a non-event Tzeentch unit to your hand. Plus, given a lucky card draw, you might be able to use this event to deploy Zave's Split Tongue onto a planet unexpectedly, where you fully intend to use any number of different effects to kill off enemy units in mass, which could have the potential benefit of putting an enormous number of cultist tokens into play at your HQ. And whether you ultimately use those tokens to deal even more damage to your opponent, or absorb more enemy attacks, or whether you simply intend to sacrifice them to put any number of different demons into play for all the fewer resources, the options are nearly limitless. And of all the different core set warlords that we've covered so far, the sheer card synergy that Zarathur and his signature squad bring to bear is absolutely mind-boggling. And for that reason, and so many more, I can scarcely think of enough good things to say about all of these cards. Without exception, I think that these are all enormously powerful, even outside of optimal circumstances, and I very much look forward to seeing what additional support and additional synergy Zarathur and the Chaos faction receive in future upcoming expansions. But that brings the discussion of the very first of our Chaos faction warlords to a close. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. If you have an opinion you'd like to share about either Zarathur or any of his signature cards, or the Chaos faction as a whole, or if you have a gameplay experience either playing as or against Zarathur, Please leave a comment below with your own tips, experience, and expertise, not only to share with a relative newcomer like myself, but with any other viewer that happens to read your comment. So, with that said, thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you again soon.